Alright, hi everyone. I hope you guys are having a great day. So this week's lecture we're going to focus on the theories of Freud. So Freud might be the person that comes to mind when you think about psychology. Probably most people, when you ask them the question, who do you think of when you think of psychology, they would probably answer Freud. But a lot of us, although we know the name and maybe we know a little bit about his theory, we might not know the specific details of it. So as we go through this lecture, I want to ask you to keep in mind the lecture from last week. So we talked about how each individual's theory was influenced by their history, who they grew up around, what their family life was like, as well as who they worked with, maybe what kinds of clients they saw. So we're going to see that Freud's theory was heavily influenced by his personal life, which is not necessarily a bad thing. I think all of our ideas of personality are influenced by our personal life. But we do need to keep that in mind as we go throughout this lecture. Okay? So we're going to talk about Freud. I'm going to ask you to keep an open mind, as some of the topics in this week's lecture might seem a little bit shocking if this is the first time you've really been introduced to Freud. Okay? Also, we do have an activity this week, so it's going to be due by Friday at 5 p.m., just like Activity 1. Please keep in mind that activities must be a minimum of 200 words to receive full credit. So please check before you submit to make sure that your response is at least 200 words. Okay? Let me know if you have any questions. Otherwise, we're going to go ahead and get into lecture for today. Alright, so as I said, this week we're going to be talking about Freud. So I don't know how much you know about Freud's theory. Something that you're going to note as we go through, that it has a couple of basic cornerstones here. So the ideas of sex and aggression are going to come up over and over again. Now, the sexual aspect of Freud's theory is very obvious. You're going to pick up on that as we go through. But aggression is there as well. Freud would say that perhaps a basic part of who we are, it would be the idea of a need for aggression, hurting yourself or someone else. And you're going to see how that plays a role in his theory as we go through. His ideas were spread by a dedicated group. So he had several different followers who really believed in what he had to say. Freud was a very convincing individual. He published a lot of articles and books. He was a great speaker, great writer, and he was very convincing to people. Now, as you'll see, Freud's research and Freud's theories have produced a lot of reactions in individuals. Some people have been very quick to say that Freud was a genius. They have adopted his ideas, and we'll see that several of the theorists that we talk about throughout the semester were influenced by Freud. There certainly were other individuals who have been offended or disturbed even by Freud's theories, who have sought to do research to try to disprove them. And we'll talk about all that throughout the lecture. So, to briefly talk about who Freud was and to get a biography on him. He was born in what is now the Czech Republic, but he spent most of his life in Vienna, Austria. So this is where he did his practice. So I think I mentioned this in the last lecture video, that the individuals that you end up working with, they will influence your theory of personality. So Freud spent a lot of time treating wealthy, often married women in Austria during this particular time period. And so there is some questions there. If what Freud was suggesting were true for these individuals, which some people would argue is not the case, but if they were, then does this actually mean anything to individuals who are not wealthy, married women in Austria during this time period? So there might be some issues with the sample that Freud chose to treat. He was the eldest son of 8, a large family, studied medicine, especially psychiatry, was very fascinated with human behavior and why people do what they do. And some of his first experiences with psychiatry had to do with studying hysteria with an individual, particularly Charcot, who focused on hypnosis. And so hypnosis is something that might still be done today by some clinicians. It's something that we've moved away from in the field of psychology. But you're going to see that this early experience with individuals with hysteria and experiences with hypnosis did greatly influence Freud's ways of thinking. So he started trying to study individuals who have hysteria. So briefly to talk about what that means, a lot of the clients that Freud was working with, they had intense anxiety, also potentially some physical symptoms that they couldn't find a medical cause for. So maybe, for example, they were having pain or they were having numbness, and the doctors couldn't find a reason for that, so they decided that perhaps there was something psychologically causing it. Now, as I said, Freud primarily studied this in women, and Freud, through the influence of his own personal life as well as some of the people he was studying with, came up with this seduction theory idea that these women that were coming to see him who were having these symptoms of hysteria, Freud believed that a lot of their issues were that they had been sexually abused as children, often by an older male individual, sometimes a family member. Now, part of this was that some of these women did tell Freud that they had experienced that kind of trauma. But Freud had the idea then that the individuals were experiencing these symptoms because they were repressing, and you're going to talk about repression later, the way that they felt about these incidents, or that they were struggling with this trauma that they had gone through. And so we certainly can see that individuals who have suffered some kind of traumatic incident like that may have anxiety or have some issues with that, certainly. But we have to be careful here then to potentially start saying that all individuals who are having these kinds of problems might have potentially had some kind of childhood trauma and might not even remember that, might have repressed that. And this is where people are critical of Freud, that if we suggest that all individuals who have these symptoms have had this kind of traumatic event, then we might start planting memories or ideas that are not actually accurate. So Freud started off his thinking by saying that seduction theory was the cause of hysteria, that these women had been seduced by older men when they were younger, and that was part of the reason why they were having these issues. Now, that particular theory was abandoned later on. Freud suggested that it was actually the Oedipus complex, which is something that we're going to talk about later in the lecture, that was causing the anxiety and the symptoms. So we're going to come back to the Oedipus complex. Freud did have much interest in dreams, and he focused on interpreting dreams. He wrote a book about interpreting dreams, and we're going to talk about dream interpretation later as well. And he did have a very devoted group of followers. Adler and Jung are some that we're going to talk about this semester. You will see that some of these followers, like Adler in particular, later became disturbed or bothered by some of Freud's ideas and split from Freud and changed their point of view. But he did have several followers who were very consistent with his ideas. And then you see that he was driven out of Austria by the Nazis and then later died. So there is one other thing that I wanted to mention about Freud before we actually get into much detail on his theory. Freud's first major publication was related to the use of cocaine. Freud thought that cocaine was a miracle drug. Now, you have to understand that during this time period, cocaine was not illegal. It was found in a lot of medicines, patent medicines, things that you could get from the grocery store or the drugstore. So it was not understood how potentially addictive cocaine was, but Freud recommended it to his clients, to his family members, and Freud used cocaine fairly heavily himself. So you might keep that in mind as we talk about Freud's theories, that there was potentially a drug issue there as well. He thought that cocaine was a miracle drug that could be used to treat depression, indigestion, asthma, various neuroses, syphilis, morphine addiction, alcoholism. So this was one thing. He was suggesting that someone who was addicted to morphine or alcohol, which are both kind of depressant drugs that slow down the neural processes, he was suggesting that to treat that, they replace it with cocaine, which is a stimulant that's going to increase energy and mood and everything, of course, for a short period of time before a very significant and potentially dangerous withdrawal happens afterwards. So Freud was correct in that cocaine is effective as a local anesthetic. So it can be used to numb certain areas, and it's effective for that. Its efficacy for treating some of these other issues is in question, and certainly, potentially, even if it did fix the problem, not a good idea to use such a dangerous drug when perhaps there are less dangerous ways of treating these issues. So just something to keep in mind about Freud. All right, diving into Freud's theory, this is talking about the different levels of mental life. So Freud suggested that we have an unconscious, a preconscious, and a conscious part of our mind. Now, Freud would say that the unconscious part of your mind is the most influential part. It's the largest part. It's where most of your decision making and your influences on your behavior happen. However, Freud would say that it is beyond your awareness. So your unconscious is something that is there. It's incredibly influential, but it's something that you're not aware of. Now, Freud would say that your urges, your drives, your instincts, which we'll talk about this later, but we already mentioned sex and aggression. So your drives to get sexual pleasure, to hurt other people, all of these things are unconscious for you. So if you were to say to Freud, no, I don't have any desire to hurt other people, Freud would say, yes, you do. It's just unconscious. You're not aware of it. So it says it's only known indirectly. We're going to talk a little bit more about this later in the lecture video. But Freud had some thoughts, and when I talk about Freud, we talk about his theory. You might hear psychodynamic or psychoanalytic approaches to psychology or therapy. Freud is certainly not the only theorist who would fall under the category of psychodynamic or psychoanalytic, but he's perhaps the best known and one of the most influential ones. So individuals who prescribe to this particular kind of thinking would say then that you use projective testing to try to measure the unconscious. We'll talk more about that later. So Freud would say that your behavior, the things that you do, are mostly influenced by your unconscious, which you're not aware of. So then you might not understand why you're thinking or feeling or doing the things that you're doing. Okay. Now, Freud would say that we also have a preconscious, which is information that we can become consciously aware of. So Freud would say most of the mind is unconscious, and even if we try, we're not really going to be able to directly become aware of it. However, the preconscious is something that's not currently in your conscious mind, but something that you could be conscious of. Maybe thinking about memories or experiences that you've had. Something could trigger that, and it could become conscious. So you're able to access something that's in your preconscious. Whereas your conscious is basically what you're thinking about right now. It is directly available. It's easy for you to access. And Freud would say that that plays a minor role. So the thoughts that you realize that you're thinking, the plans that you have for your behavior throughout the day, Freud would say are actually not terribly influential, because most of what is determining what you do then is beyond your control. So if we go back to some of the terms from the last lecture video, Freud would be seen as a very deterministic individual. In other words, you don't have free choice here, or free will, because your unconscious is dictating your behavior and you can't really control your unconscious. Okay? So Freud would suggest your unconscious is hidden, it's below the surface, you can't see it, but it's there and it's influencing you. Excellent. Now, when we're talking about Freud's theory of personality, Freud suggested that we have these three aspects to our personality that are constantly competing with each other. So, starting with the id, it says the id is the primary process because the id is the first part of your personality to develop. And Freud would say that you're born with an id. Now, the purpose of the id is to get what it wants. The id is really only interested in pleasing itself, and it doesn't particularly care how it gets what it wants. It just wants to get what it wants, okay? Now, when you're thinking about Freud's theory, you'll notice that you can see that some of this could definitely be true. If you've had any experience with young children, you've spent time around them, Freud would say you're born with an id, but you don't yet have your ego and your superego. So, the very young child, baby, it only wants what it wants. When it's hungry, when it's tired, when it wants its diaper changed, it's going to cry. The baby doesn't care how much that bothers you. The baby just wants to get what it wants. Okay? After some time passes, the ego will start to develop. Now, this is the secondary process. It's the second part of your personality that develops. The ego is more in touch with reality, and the ego is the executive here. We're going to see that when we have all three parts of our personality in play, that the ego is going to be the one that's going to try to balance the other two. So it's really the decision maker, the one in control, at least in an individual who is psychologically healthy. Freud would say that the ego is in control there. But the ego really functions on the reality principle. In other words, okay, yes, id, I understand you want what you want, but we're going to have to think of a way that is a better way for you to get that, right? So the idea that, okay, just because you want something doesn't mean that you can lay down on the floor and throw a temper tantrum and get it. That might not work. Maybe it'll work with your grandparents, but maybe it won't work with your parents. So let's think of a more realistic way of trying to get what we want. And then the superego is going to be the part of your personality that develops last. The reason why the superego takes longer is that you have to have a lot of experiences with authority figures before you can develop your superego. So your superego, it says it's made up of the conscious and the ego ideal. The idea here is that our parents, typically our parents or whoever is providing the discipline and the structure in our lives, they punish us when we do things that we shouldn't do. And that's related to our conscious, right? We do something and they tell us you're not supposed to do that, that's bad, right? And punish children. The ego ideal says that, okay, when I do good things, I get rewarded for that. So the basic idea behind the superego is that it is your conscience that's telling you what's okay and what's not okay. You internalize the rules of society and the rules of your parents, and the superego is going to be incredibly moral. So, if the id is the part of your personality that wants what it wants and doesn't care how it gets it, the superego is the part of your personality that says you need to be respectful, you need to think about other people first. You can see that the id and the superego will always be in contrast with each other, will always be fighting against each other. So the ego then is the one trying to balance the two. So Freud would say that perhaps psychological illness happens when the ego is not able to balance the id and the superego. So maybe perhaps you find yourself in a situation where someone has upset you. The id says, get that person back, hurt that person, get what you want, don't let them do this to you. The superego would say, you can't hurt other people, it's wrong to hurt other people, you should not stand up to this person. The ego then is going to have to try to decide what to do with that. It's the executive, it's the part that is really the most in touch with reality. So the ego is going to have to try to balance the needs of the id and the superego. Okay? Now, when we're talking about Freud's theory, we said that it was built on the cornerstones of sex and aggression. So when we talk about libido here, this is Freud's idea about sex and about the sex drive, which you're going to see more in a second when we talk about the psychosexual stages. But Freud said that most of what we do is influenced by these sexual feelings that we have, that we need to have met, these desires that we have. Now, an individual could say, I don't have these sexual desires, I don't feel this way that you're suggesting that I do. Freud would just say, you're not aware of the fact that you feel this way, it's unconscious to you. So you could probably never win an argument with Freud, right? I hope that you're picking up on that. Also, we have this thanatos or aggression drive, a drive to hurt other people, potentially to hurt ourselves. So Freud would say then that we all have these desires, this aggression, this destruction, and that because society tells us that it's not okay to be constantly obsessed with sex, and it's not okay to be constantly obsessed with aggression, that you have to hide these things, repress them, make them unconscious. But then even if they are unconscious, even if you're trying not to allow yourself to feel them, you still find yourself being influenced by these desires. So you could, and we'll talk about some more examples in a second, you could think of different ways where perhaps an individual, even if they're not aware of it, might be trying to get sexual pleasure or might be trying to meet this need for aggression. Perhaps we have someone who's super competitive, for example, or someone who considers themselves to be the best, the perfectionist, right? Also, something interesting here, masochism and sadism, right? So sadism is the idea of someone who gets sexual pleasure from hurting another person. And masochism is the idea of getting sexual pleasure from being hurt. So you could see that both sadism and masochism could satisfy both drives here. A combination of sexual pleasure and aggression, either receiving the aggression or giving the aggression here. So Freud would say we have a lot of pent up or built up aggression and sexual desire that then influences our behavior more than we ever realize, right? Freud would also say that most individuals do struggle with anxiety and that the ego tries to repress this, that the ego tries to protect us from this. And we'll talk about some defense mechanisms shortly that our ego uses to try to reduce this anxiety. But Freud said there are several different types of anxiety, briefly discussing them. Neurotic anxiety has to do with fear of the unknown, fear of what might happen. Moral anxiety has to do with guilt. So perhaps here when an individual has this superego that is maybe a little bit too developed, an individual who is kind of hyper moral or someone who is constantly very worried about doing things wrong, upsetting other people, making mistakes, Freud would say that individual is likely to suffer from moral anxiety because of all of the guilt and the shame. And then realistic anxiety being a little bit more close to just daily, day-to-day life, like fear that we feel, anxiety that we feel, that's a little bit more natural to us. Right? All right, so your ego is the executive. It's the part of your personality that is in control, that is trying to maintain psychological health here. So your ego, according to Freud, has a lot that it has to do. And so defense mechanisms are really things that your ego does to try to protect itself, right? Anytime that there's a threat to your ego, a threat to your mental health, the ego then has to try to find a way to thwart that. So there are several different ones listed here. Repression is probably the one that you hear most, and I think already during this short lecture I've used the term repression several times. But repression has to do with like an unconscious denial of something, or maybe there's something that is so disturbing to you that bothers you so much that you repress it. It's almost like you can't bear to think about it. So then you don't allow yourself to think about it to the point that you might even completely forget it. And Freud would say that, for example, some individuals might have had some childhood trauma. And of course, since Freud is particularly focused on sex, Freud might say that there was childhood sexual abuse that the individual was then like unable to deal with. So they repressed it, they pushed it down into their unconscious. And so then Freud would say that even though it's unconscious and it's not in our awareness, it is still disturbing to us and can still cause, for example, hysteria, right? These neurotic symptoms. Okay. So repression is one that Freud talked about a lot. Reaction formation has to do with maybe you've realized that you have a feeling and you don't like it. So you try then to feel something opposite, or you try to compensate for that feeling. Like, for example, perhaps you feel, let's just think about this from Freud's point of view, perhaps you feel a sexual desire towards someone that you believe that you're not supposed to feel sexual desire towards. So in that situation, maybe you feel guilty for that, you feel anxious over that, and so one way that an individual, according to Freud, might try to deal with that would be to convince themselves that they hate that person, that they really dislike that person, to be angry with that person all the time, because Freud would say then that you're trying to compensate for your desire to sleep with that person by convincing yourself, I don't want to sleep with that person, I actually can't stand that person. Okay. Now, as you might be thinking about some of this as we go through, you'll see that there are some aspects of Freud's theory that seem to make sense to us, some that might make a little bit less sense, and you'll have an opportunity to discuss that in your activity for this week, but we'll get to that, all right? Displacement has to do with taking whatever you're feeling out on someone that you consider it's safe to take it out on, right? So maybe you feel angry with your boss, but you're probably not going to blow up at your boss. It's probably not a good idea because your boss is an individual who is in a position of authority and could fire you, for example. So then perhaps this person might go home and kick the dog. You hear people use that term. Or go home and yell at their kids or at their spouse. The idea here is that you're taking that pent-up aggression and you're letting it out on a person that you feel like is more safe for you to do that. Once again, I am not saying that any of these things are good things, just explaining to you the way that Freud thought about things. Fixation is something that will come up again in a second when we talk about psychosexual stages. Freud said that we have these stages that we progress through as part of our development, and that an individual who is able to successfully get through each stage without any major issues will go on to the next just fine. The problem is that if you have a problem in a certain stage, you might stay fixated there. In other words, even though you're getting older, like chronologically, psychologically, your development is hindered. It's kind of held behind at a certain place, and we'll talk about that in a second. Regression has to do with an individual maybe kind of going back to an earlier period of life. An example of this might be a child. Maybe when a child is going through something, they're experiencing a lot of anxiety, maybe they start acting as if they were much younger. So we think about an example of this maybe when parents have another child, they bring home a baby, maybe the older child starts wanting to sleep in the baby's crib or starts wanting to have a pacifier again or that kind of thing. Kind of regressing back to an earlier period of life and kind of having that childish behavior there. And we do see that that happens sometimes. Children, when they're stressed out, maybe new child, maybe they had a move, maybe there's some other problem, children do kind of regress sometimes temporarily. So that could be, according to Freud, a potential defense mechanism, something the ego is using to try to protect itself. Projection has to do with taking whatever you see in yourself that you don't like and putting it on someone else. Like, for example, this is an individual who perhaps is cheating on their spouse, and they become convinced that their spouse is cheating on them. So this almost manifests itself as paranoia a little bit, right? Or someone who is talking about other people behind their back. They think other people are talking about them, right? The idea here is that because your superego needs to follow the rules, it cannot possibly comprehend the fact that you have done this behavior that is so against social norms. So instead of focusing on the behavior in yourself, you start seeing it in other people. That then allows you to point the finger at the other person instead of focusing on your own shortcomings or your own mistakes, right? So then an individual who is cheating on his wife, for example, might then become obsessed with the idea that his wife is cheating on him, might start following her around or doing other, potentially unhealthy behaviors here. Because the individual can't deal with what they're doing, they push that off on someone else, right? Introjection has to do with someone who might be perhaps obsessed with another person, and they start to believe that they have the characteristics that that other person has. For example, we might see this as like hero worship is one way that I've heard this described, where maybe perhaps someone has a hero or someone that they look up to and they have traits that they see in them. They start to incorporate that into their own life. They start to believe that they really are like other people. So Freud would say that perhaps to help you deal with your own unconscious dislike of yourself, you might start telling yourself what a good person you are because you were like this other person that you look up to. Okay? And then finally, sublimation is another defense mechanism here where an individual has these impulses, whether it be related to sex or related to aggression or something else. Of course, with Freud, it's typically sex and aggression. And then this individual tries to find a more socially acceptable way to express this, right? I mean, maybe perhaps we can think about this. Someone who has a desire for aggression might be a football player, for example, or go into a career that involves aggression, and then they can be looked up to and seen as a role model or something because they have this particular position, right? Or some other things, maybe they say that someone has pent-up sexual desire, and then this leads them to find some other way of pursuing pleasure that actually is beneficial to other people, right? So sublimation is trying to find a way to get what you want in a socially acceptable way. All right, so let's get into the psychosexual stages here. You see stages of development. Really, this issue incorporates most of the things that we've already talked about with Freud. So Freud would say that we go through these stages. We have the oral phase, anal phase, phallic phase, latency period, and then genital period as well. So during the oral phase, this is the first, I've heard different numbers, the first year to maybe 18 months of the child's life. If you think about it, the main way that children receive pleasure during this stage is with their mouth, right? So children who are feeding, whether that be breastfeeding or bottle feeding, and then they're also maybe putting toys in their mouth or chewing on everything. And that's why when you have young children around, you have to baby-proof the house because they put everything in their mouth, right? The oral phase has to do with them receiving pleasure from their mouth. So Freud would say that a child who is able to successfully get through the stage, move on to the next stage, won't have any problems. However, what happens if there is a problem here? Like, for example, if your parents didn't feed you often enough or fed you too much? Or what if the individual experienced maybe excessive anxiety or excessive frustration when the individual is no longer allowed to breastfeed or to bottle feed anymore and has to switch to other kinds of food? Freud would say that if an individual had some kind of issue during the oral phase, they might develop an oral fixation. So you saw fixation on the previous slide talking about defense mechanisms. So maybe you've heard this. If you say someone has an oral fixation, it's like they're always having to put something in their mouth. They're always chewing on something. So someone who is always chewing gum or someone who smokes, for example, could potentially, according to Freud, everything I say in this lecture is according to Freud, might potentially have an oral fixation. Okay. After that, we move on to the anal phase, which is, from about 18 months to about 3, so the next about 18 months of life. During this phase, the big accomplishment is that children start potty training typically. So Freud theorized that it brings a child pleasure to be able to successfully master potty training. But what happens if a child struggles with potty training, or if a parent perhaps shames a child for having accidents? In that situation, Freud would say that that person might develop an anal fixation. So you might have heard that term or heard just someone say that person is really anal. That kind of indicating someone who is a perfectionist or has to have things a certain way, maybe a neat freak kind of thing. Once again, this is what Freud said. All right, the phallic phase is from 3 to about 5 or 6, depending. The phallic phase, according to Freud, is where a child realizes that he or she has genitals and starts to have sexual desires really take a part here. Now, this seems strange, perhaps. We're talking about children who are 3, and we're talking about sexual desires, but Freud would say this is when it starts. And so Freud would say that little boys go through the Oedipus complex, little girls go through the Electra complex. Now, briefly to cover this, I'm not sure if you've read Oedipus Rex. I have not personally read the entire thing. I have briefly kind of glanced over it, skimmed it. But it's a myth, not a true story, but a myth about an individual who was separated from his parents at birth, was raised by another family, and was not aware that the family he was raised with was not actually his biological family. So later on, he grows up, and through some series of unfortunate events, kills his biological father. He's not aware that it's his biological father, so he kills his biological father. And because he killed the biological father, he is somehow entitled to take his biological mother as his wife. Now, once again, he did not realize that this was his biological mother, so he married his mother and had children with her. Now, this is just a myth, but Freud would suggest that an individual, a young boy, has a sexual desire for his mother. Now, of course, this issue has then led people to speculate about Freud's relationship with his own mother, which I will not dwell on here, but it does raise some questions there. But Freud then would say that all little boys want to sleep with their mothers, and then therefore, because they want to sleep with their mothers, it makes them jealous and aggressive toward their fathers, which then causes anxiety because the child realizes the superego, if the superego is developed, starting to develop here perhaps, the child realizes it's not acceptable for him to want to sleep with his mother and to want to hurt his father. So then, perhaps the way that he might deal with this, we talked about reaction formation, about how if you feel something and then you consider it unacceptable, that you might try to convince yourself you feel something totally opposite. So Freud would say that little boys, they hate their fathers, they want to kill them, but they understand that they're not supposed to feel that way. So to try to compensate for that, they tell themselves that they love their fathers, they want to be like their fathers, and they start imitating their fathers and kind of hero worshiping their father, right? So once again, this is just a theory. I'm just telling you what Freud had to say. So then Freud would say that boys might have castration anxiety, or they might be concerned that their fathers are going to castrate them. Okay? Now, lest you ladies feel left out, Freud had a theory about you as well, that females, young girls, have this Electra complex, which is the female version of the Oedipus complex, which suggests then that little girls want to sleep with their fathers and are angry with and aggressive toward their mothers. But then, once again, because we understand that that's not an acceptable way to feel, little girls might then find themselves trying to imitate their mother or be more like their mother to help them deal with the anxiety that is raised by their feelings of aggression towards their mother. Okay, so then Freud would suggest that females go through this period of penis envy, where they are upset because they are not boys. Okay, just telling you what Freud had to say here. So then we have a latency period. Basically a period of your life that this text says 5, I've also heard 6 somewhere, 5 or 6-ish. The individual goes into this latency period where they start going to school and they have a lot of other things going on, and it's not that your sexual aggression impulses go away, it's more that they are suppressed. They are repressed, they're not as much of an issue, they kind of take a back seat. But then we hit puberty. And as you might imagine, during the genital period, an individual here then becomes very, very focused on sexual pleasure. And Freud would say that this genital period pretty much lasts for the rest of your life. However, he did hint at the possibility that some individuals might reach a maturity stage where sex becomes a little less important in their lives. Now, a little bit of a background into what we know about Freud's own sex life. It seems that Freud had a lot of issues himself, one of which I have heard that Freud's wife was an individual who got pregnant very easily and had a lot of health complications during pregnancy. And so it got to the point where it was not healthy for her to have any more children. And so potentially then Freud might have had some pent-up sexual frustration of his own here, but perhaps then he would tell himself that he had reached maturity where he no longer needed sex. I'm sure Freud found a way to deal with the anxiety in his own life. Excellent. So what do we do with this information that we've talked about? Applications of psychoanalytic theory. I mentioned projective testing earlier. The idea that pretty much the only thing that's influencing you is your unconscious, and you're not aware of your unconscious, then leads to the question, how do you assess personality? How do you try to understand or interpret something that you can't see? So Freud used something called projective testing. So the idea behind a projective test is to give the individual something that is neutral, basically, and then see if they will project what they're feeling onto it, right? So, like, for example, the Rorschach ink blot test that maybe some of you have heard of or you've seen pictures of, you can Google to get an idea of what those look like. The idea is it's supposed to be just a random set of ink blots, but then the psychodynamic therapist would say, what do you see in this picture? And there's a really funny Big Bang Theory clip. I don't know if you guys watch the Big Bang Theory, but there's a clip where Sheldon, one of the main characters, is receiving an award, but he has to give a speech. And he was very anxious about public speaking. So Leonard, his roommate, is trying to help him try to figure out why he has this anxiety. And so Sheldon says, well, would it help if I tell you my answers to the ink blot test? Okay, sure. A is a bat. B is a bat. C is a bat, and D is my father killing my mother with a hypodermic needle. Okay, so that is obviously making light of projective testing, but the idea here is that sometimes an individual might feel safe telling something when it's talking about a stimuli, a picture. Another test here, they use the thematic apperception test, which if you're interested, you can Google the TAT, thematic apperception test, to see pictures, but they're just pictures of people, and they're supposed to be neutral pictures that are neither good nor bad. But then someone might say, okay, tell me a story about what you see in the picture, and the individual might start telling you things about themselves, actually, that are in their unconscious they're not aware of. So that's projective testing. Free association is related to that. they would say, okay, you just start talking and just start saying whatever comes to mind, even if it seems completely unrelated, just start talking. And the idea is that sooner or later, eventually, once you just start talking, whatever it is that you're feeling, whatever it is that's bothering you, will gradually work its way out. Now, a couple of terms that you'll hear when we talk about Freud is transference and resistance. So, transference has to do with the relationship between the client and the psychodynamic therapist or psychoanalytic therapist. So, these individuals who have this theory would then say that the therapist is like an authority figure over the client. And so it may be that the client starts to transfer whatever feelings, positive or negative, that they have about their own authority figures, like maybe perhaps their parents. They'll start to transfer that onto the clinician. So it's kind of the idea that the therapist or the clinician is the neutral ink blot picture, and you project onto it whatever you're feeling. So that if a client maybe becomes particularly angry at the clinician for no reason, the clinician might say, oh, I see. So you're angry at your father, and you're projecting that onto me. That's transference, where you start to feel towards the clinician how you feel towards other people. Resistance has to do with individuals who maybe refuse to talk about a particular subject. For example, maybe they don't want to talk about their mother, they don't want to talk about their father, and the psychodynamic therapist would say, I see that you're resisting this, you're trying not to talk about this, there must be something there that's bothering you, and they would try to probe deeper. So dream analysis is something else that's related to psychodynamic or psychoanalytic therapy. I mentioned earlier that Freud wrote a novel about dream analysis here. Freud's idea on dream analysis is that your unconscious desires can sneak into your dreams. But Freud would say that typically the obvious content of the dream doesn't actually tell you anything. You have to then interpret the dream to understand what it means. So the manifest content of a dream would be the parts of the dream that you remember. So if I said, okay, tell me about a dream you had last night, and you start telling me, well, I was in this place with this person and this happened, that's the manifest content. The manifest content is literally just a description of what you dreamed. So the client would tell the manifest content to the therapist. Then the therapist would tell the latent content to the client. In other words, they would interpret that. The latent content is what the therapist believes your dream really means, or the unconscious processes that were related to your dream. And then finally, I'm sure you've probably heard of Freudian slips before. Freud would say there's no such thing as a coincidence. There's no such thing as an accident. If you call someone by the wrong name, or you say something and you say, oh, I didn't mean to say that, Freud would say that you did mean to say that there are no accidents, but that's just your unconscious slipping out. So there are several different ways, according to psychodynamic theory, to try to interpret the unconscious. Okay? Now, there's been a lot of criticism of Freud, as you might imagine, as we've talked about some of his theories. First of all, Freud primarily saw female clients, which is potentially a problem because we don't know if these results really generalize to other individuals. But some individuals have suggested that although Freud did primarily see female clients, he didn't actually understand women. And individuals have often been offended by what Freud had to say about women, about the issues that women have. Also, the major issue with Freud is that you can't test most of what he said. You hear something and you say, okay, well, that could be true. I could see how that could make sense. But there's absolutely no way to test it. Now, yes, we have projective testing, but projective testing is often very questionable in the areas of reliability and validity. And so in those cases, we don't actually know if we have correctly interpreted the unconscious. Think about this. If I have 6 different ink blots and I show that same ink blot test to 100 different people, I'm going to get 600 different answers about what they see. But which ones are right and which ones are wrong? And does it actually mean if one person says a bat and one person says a butterfly, does that actually tell me anything? So this is where we start to get into the question of how do we accurately, validly measure something that we can't see? And does it make sense, and is it appropriate for the therapist to be seen as the expert on the client's interpretations or the client's experiences of life? Does it make sense for Freud to say, I know you better than you know you, right? So sometimes it seems very loosely organized. Some of the ideas seem a little bit out there. However, it has generated considerable research. Individuals have either set out to perhaps prove or disprove Freud's theory, and so Freud is not going to go away. Obviously, he has brought a lot of attention to the field of psychology, and we should give him credit where credit is due there. However, we do know that a lot of Freud's theories are just about impossible to falsify. You can never disprove Freud, because if you find something's not true, he would just say you didn't dig deep enough, it's too unconscious, you weren't able to reach it. So there's no way to falsify this, which means it's not super practical, it's not very helpful. If you're telling me that your problem is caused by an electric complex and you have penis envy, what am I supposed to do with that? How am I supposed to help a client with that? However, it is very internally consistent in that there's a basic cornerstone of sex and aggression, and pretty much everything Freud had to say went back to that. Excellent. All right, so how did Freud see the world? Deterministic, meaning that you don't have much control over your own experiences. Free will, not much here, because your unconscious is in control and you don't have much control over your unconscious. Relatively pessimistic view that all we are after is our own sexual pleasure and hurting other people is not a very optimistic way to look at people. Obviously, he emphasized the unconscious, saying that there is a conscious, but that it's minor and doesn't influence us much. Plays a large role in biology, in nature here. So we talked about different age ranges, and we're basically assuming that those are the same for everyone because everyone goes through the same stages of life at the same time. A very big focus on nature, a little bit less on nurture here. And then he did see that there were some parts of your personality that were unique, and there are some parts of personality that are the same for all. So fairly equal emphasis on that. All right, so now that you know about Freud's theory, I want to ask you this week, what aspects of Freud's theory appeal to you, and what aspects of Freud's theory do not appeal to you, and then to explain those answers for me. So it may be that some of the things that we discussed today made sense to you, and you could say, okay, I can see examples in my own life where perhaps that was the case. Maybe some of the things we talked about disgusted you or disturbed you. Feel free to tell me that as well, but explain your answers here and make sure that your activity responses are at least 200 words long. Okay? All right, that is the end of lecture 4 today. So let me know if you have any questions. Don't forget about the activity, and then next week we will talk about Adler. So if you need me, email me, come by my office hours. Otherwise, I will talk to you guys next week.